house was too quiet, too still. The kind of silence that didn't just sit in the air, it pressed against you, heavy, suffocating, alive. Elliot Graves lay on his bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, his body tense with the kind of exhaustion that refused to drag him under. Insomnia had been his constant companion for years, but tonight was different. There was something wrong, something just outside the edges of his understanding. He could feel it, a weight in the air, a pressure in his skull, a sensation in his gut that told him he wasn't as alone as he thought. Then his phone erupted with a violent buzz, the vibration rattling against his nightstand so forcefully that it nearly slid off the edge. He jolted upright, his pulse slamming against his ribs. His first thought was that it was a weather alert, maybe an Amber Alert. But when he picked up the phone and looked at the screen, his breath hitched. Emergency alert, unknown entities detected. Remain indoors, do not engage, do not look at them. His skin prickled. What kind of alert was that? He had never seen anything like it before. His mind immediately flicked to thoughts of hackers, pranks, some kind of hoax. But then, why had his phone been shaking so violently? Emergency alerts weren't supposed to do that. He unlocked his phone, fingers trembling slightly, and opened his browser. There was nothing on the news. No alerts, no warnings, no breaking reports. Just silence. A cold unease settled into his bones as he hesitated, then pulled back his curtain just an inch, just enough to peer outside. The street was empty. Not just quiet, empty. No cars, no street dogs, no wind, not even the distant hum of power lines. The world outside looked wrong, like a photograph frozen in time, stripped of all motion. The air itself seemed still, like even the oxygen had stopped moving. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that stretched unnaturally, flickering slightly, even though there wasn't so much as a breeze. He swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of the sound of his own breathing. Then the power flickered. His bedside lamp blinked out for a full second before coming back on, casting the room in brief, suffocating darkness. The hallway light outside his room did the same. The entire house shuddered with an eerie, quiet pulse, as if the electricity itself had hesitated. Elliot's mouth went dry. He closed the curtain. His hands clenched the fabric for a moment longer than necessary. Then came the knock. Slow, rhythmic, too controlled. Not frantic, not desperate. Not the kind of knock that came from a person in need of help. This knock had purpose. It had patience. Elliot stiffened. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his throat. The knock came again, 3 times. Steady, even, calculated. Someone was at his door. But he knew that no one should be there. His parents were out of town. He wasn't expecting anyone. He hadn't ordered food. His phone buzzed again. His stomach dropped as he glanced at the screen. Do not open the door. Do not make a sound. Elliot's breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the phone. Every instinct screamed at him to not move, to not breathe. Then, the doorknob turned, a slow, deliberate click. The sound sent a white-hot bolt of terror through him, paralyzing him in place. He hadn't unlocked it. The air in the room shifted. He felt it, like the atmosphere had changed, thickened, congealed around him. His ears rang with the crushing silence, the kind that made his own heartbeat sound deafening. The knob twisted again, more insistent this time. Then the scratching began. Low, methodical. Just beneath the doorframe, a deliberate, dragging sound, like something was tracing its fingers across the wood. Long fingers. Elliot took a step back. The floorboard beneath his foot creaked. The scratching stopped. A moment of unbearable stillness. His lungs burned, screaming for air. Then something slid under the door. Not a hand, not a foot, a shadow. Long, stretching wrong, tendrils of darkness crawling into the room like spilled ink. It wasn't cast by anything. It wasn't caused by the light outside. It was moving on its own. Elliot's stomach twisted into a knot of cold, primal terror as he stumbled back, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The shadow twitched. Then, it moved toward him. Elliot turned and ran. But the darkness moved faster. The shadow on the floor slithered toward him, stretching, reaching. It wasn't supposed to move like that. Shadows didn't behave like living things. They didn't chase. But this one did. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as he reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he clutched it. The screen flashed violently in his hand, the emergency alert pulsing again. But this time the words had changed. Do not open the door. Do not make a sound. His stomach clenched. His skin felt too tight, his heartbeat too loud. The thing outside the door knew he was inside. It had tried the lock. It had slipped beneath the door. But this message, this warning, felt different, more urgent, more personal. Then the scratching started again. Not at the door this time, at the walls. A slow, deliberate drag like nails scraping across wood. It started in the hallway, but then it moved, a sickening wet sound, as if something was sliding inside the walls, shifting, repositioning itself. The noise slithered up toward the ceiling, creeping along the beams, spreading through the house like rot. Elliot's breath hitched as the sound traveled toward the back of the house. Then, another knock. His body went rigid. It wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the back. He stood frozen, his entire being screaming at him to not move. The first knock had been slow, methodical. But this one was heavier, impatient. The phone in his hand vibrated so hard it nearly slipped from his grip. He forced himself to glance down. Another message. Do not look at them. A deep, cold dread pooled in his stomach. A sickening realization curdled in his mind. There was more than one. His body moved before his brain could stop it. Careful, silent. He crept toward the back window, barely breathing, barely existing. His fingers trembled as he reached for the curtain, pulling it back just a fraction of an inch. His blood turned to ice. Under the streetlight in his backyard, something was standing there. At first, his brain refused to process it. It was shaped like a person, but it wasn't. Its limbs were too long. Its head twitched, jerking in tiny, unnatural spasms. The light above it flickered erratically, casting sharp, shifting shadows. But even as the light pulsed, the figure remained wrong. Its body seemed to lag behind, well, like it wasn't fully tethered to reality. Then its head snapped toward him. Elliot's stomach lurched. It knew he was watching. His breath locked in his throat as the figure tilted its head. The movement was jagged, too sharp, like a broken marionette yanked by invisible strings. Then, without warning, it took a step forward. The backyard light shattered. Elliot stumbled back, his heart hammering so hard it sent waves of nausea through his stomach. The room plunged into darkness, his vision struggling to adjust. Then, the lights inside the house flickered violently. Not just once. Over and over, rapid and uneven, as if something was inside the wiring. The walls pulsed with the hum of unstable electricity. The shadows twisted, expanded. And then, in the flickering dark, he heard it. A whisper. Elliot, we see you. The voice didn't come from outside. It came from inside the house. Elliot's breath came out in short, uneven gasps, his pulse hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. That voice, inside the house. It hadn't come from outside. It had been right there, in the flickering dark, whispering his name like it had been waiting for him to listen. A surge of terror sent him bolting for his room, his legs barely holding him up as he stumbled down the hall. The walls seemed to breathe around him, the shadows shifting in ways they shouldn't. He slammed the door shut, locking it in one frantic motion before shoving his dresser against it. The scraping sound of wood against wood made his skin crawl, but he didn't care. He needed a barrier. His hands fumbled for the flashlight on his nightstand. The second he flicked it on, the shadows in the room recoiled, shrinking into the corners. The weak beam of light felt like the only thing keeping them from pressing in. Then, his phone vibrated violently against the mattress. The screen flashed, another emergency alert blinking at him in stark, blood-red letters. Do not look at their faces. His body turned to ice. His hands were already shaking, but now it was worse. He didn't understand. Not fully, but he knew something was watching. His thumb moved on instinct, scrolling through his feed. His town, once silent, was waking up in fear. Cryptic messages filled his screen, each one worse than the last. Why don't they have eyes? They're standing in my yard. They mimic voices. Don't trust what you hear. Elliot's stomach churned. These weren't random horror posts. This was real. It was happening everywhere. A part of him wanted to believe this was some twisted prank, but the dread in his gut said otherwise. The messages were spreading fast, too fast. People were seeing them. People were looking. His phone buzzed again. A notification. A FaceTime request. His mother. His throat tightened. That was impossible. His mother was on a flight. She had texted him hours ago, complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi. She couldn't be calling. But the call didn't stop. The name glowed on the screen, the familiar photo of her smiling face sending a nauseating chill down his spine. His thumb hovered over the decline button, every nerve in his body screaming at him to ignore it. Then, the screen glitched. The call answered itself. A black screen. No sound, no video, just darkness. Elliot's breath hitched. Mom? Silence. Then, a sound. Something wet. A slow, uneven breath, like someone was too close to the microphone. A low, distorted voice crackled through the speaker. Not his mother's. Elliot. His body seized, fingers going numb around the phone. The voice wasn't right. It sounded like his mother, but wrong. Like something was struggling to copy her tone, her inflections, as if it knew the words but not the meaning. His thumb slammed against the power button. Nothing happened. The screen flickered. The call continued. A sharp electronic hiss filled the speaker. Then, the camera turned on. Elliot's stomach dropped. For a fraction of a second, the image was distorted, shifting. Then, the face appeared. Too close. Too wrong. It had no eyes, just smooth, stretched skin where they should have been, like someone had wiped them away. But it was grinning. A horrible, stretched smile that wasn't human. It tilted its head in quick, unnatural jerks. And then it moved closer, as if it could see him through the screen. Then, the connection cut out. Elliot threw his phone across the room. The second it hit the floor, the whispering began. Not from the phone, not from outside, from inside the walls. The whispering didn't stop. It slithered through the walls, crawling under the floorboards, pressing against the ceiling like 1,000 unseen mouths murmuring in unison. Elliot could feel it, inside his skull, behind his eyes, curling around his thoughts like smoke. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he backed away from his phone, still lying face down on the carpet. His pulse pounded in his ears, his body locked in place, every instinct screaming at him to run. Then he heard it. Not a whisper, a breath. Slow, ragged, right behind him. He spun, his stomach knotting so violently he nearly collapsed. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. And then, a noise, a soft exhale. It came from above. His gaze shot upward. The air vent, just above his closet, was wide open. Too open. The slats were bent outward, as if something had been forcing its way through. The whispering grew louder. Elliot staggered back, his hands shaking as he reached for anything to defend himself. His mind barely registered the feeling of cold steel as he grabbed the kitchen knife he had swiped earlier, his grip unsteady. The vent was too dark inside. The light from his lamp barely touched it, swallowed by a depth that shouldn't be there. It was like looking into a void, a hollow space that stretched too far back. Then the air shifted. Something moved inside. A voice drifted out. His voice. "Elliot, let me out." His blood turned to ice. It sounded exactly like him. The same cadence, the same breathlessness. But he hadn't spoken. He took a trembling step backward. His throat was too tight to swallow, his hands slick with sweat. The voice came again, more urgent, more desperate. "Elliot, I can't breathe. Let me out." His grip tightened around the knife. The vent burst open. A hand shot out, long, twisting, wrong. Its fingers curled against the wall, skin too pale, too stretched. The joints bent the wrong way as it dragged itself forward, its knuckles cracking like splintering wood. Elliot ran. His feet barely touched the ground as he tore through the hallway, his vision blurring at the edges. He could hear it, crawling behind him, scuttling too fast. The whispering had changed. It wasn't just murmurs anymore. It was laughing. A new vibration rattled in his pocket. Another emergency alert. He nearly tripped over his own feet as he yanked out his phone, his eyes scanning the message in blind terror. "Do not trust your own reflection." Elliot's body went cold. His momentum slowed just enough to make a mistake. He turned toward the hallway mirror and froze. His reflection was still smiling, but he wasn't. His breath caught in his throat. His chest rose and fell frantically, his face twisted in sheer panic, but the reflection didn't match. It stood perfectly still, grinning. His stomach flipped. The muscles in his legs screamed for him to move, to run, to do anything, but his body wouldn't obey. The reflection's eyes locked onto his. Then, slowly, it lifted a hand and waved. Elliot stumbled backward. The mirror shattered, the pieces fell outward, and his reflection stepped through. Elliot ran. His own face, his own body, had just stepped out of the mirror, grinning, eyes gleaming with something that wasn't human. The glass shards crunched under its bare feet as it tilted its head, watching him with amusement. He didn't wait to see what it would do next. He bolted. The front door should have been locked, but as he grabbed the handle, it swung open on its own. No resistance, like it had been waiting for him. Outside, the air was wrong. It hit him like stepping into a dream that wasn't his. The sky, too dark. There were no stars, no moon, just an endless black void stretching above. The houses across the street loomed in unnatural stillness. Their windows were too empty, too hollow. There was no wind, no sound, just silence. A crushing, suffocating silence. Elliot took a step forward. His breath clouded in the air, even though it wasn't cold. The pavement under his bare feet felt soft, not like concrete, like something else, something that shifted when he moved. His house, the one he had just fled from, suddenly felt distant. He turned back, but was it always that far? No. It had been right there, but now it seemed smaller, further away. The door still hung open, but the inside was pitch black, like the house had been hollowed out. A sound. Footsteps. He froze. The sound wasn't coming from the house, it was coming from everywhere, soft, deliberate. But when he looked, no one was there. A street lamp flickered overhead. The light barely cut through the dark, casting shadows that twitched. Not from the wind, there was no wind. They moved on their own. Then a voice. Small, innocent. A child's whisper carried through the silence. "You weren't supposed to leave." Elliot's lungs locked. He turned. A figure stood in the middle of the street. At first, it was just a silhouette, tall, still, watching. But as the streetlight flickered again, the details came into view. His stomach clenched. It was him, standing there, perfectly still. Same clothes, same stance, same face. Except not quite. The features were too sharp, the smile too wide, the eyes empty. Elliot's knees nearly buckled. His breath came in short, frantic gasps, his body screaming at him to move. The figure didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then it tilted its head and lunged. Elliot barely had time to react before the thing that wore his face lunged. It moved too fast. Not like a person, more like a glitching video, skipping forward in unnatural jerks. 1 second, it was across the street. The next, right in front of him. He threw himself backward, hitting the pavement hard, his hands scraping against the rough surface. His other self loomed over him, its head twitching in small, sharp movements, like it was still trying to figure out how to move like a human. Then it grinned, a mouth full of teeth that weren't his. Elliot scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't think, he just ran. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't dare stop. The streets blurred past him, but something was wrong. The town wasn't the same. The houses looked twisted, stretched. The roads curved in ways they never had before. Buildings stood where they shouldn't be. Then, light. A flickering glow cut through the unnatural darkness. A neon sign buzzed weakly ahead, its letters barely legible. KXPR radio, on air. Elliot slowed. This place, it shouldn't be here. He had lived in this town his entire life. There was no radio station out here, especially not one that looked this old, this forgotten. The windows were covered in grime, the door slightly ajar. From inside, a faint voice crackled through unseen speakers. A broadcast. He had no other choice. He darted inside, slamming the door behind him. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something stale, like the place had been abandoned for years. Old radio equipment cluttered the small room, the walls lined with yellowed newspaper clippings. The voice over the radio continued. It was warped, distorted, like the signal barely held on. But the words were clear enough to make his stomach drop. To anyone still alive, do not listen to them. Do not let them touch you. You must. The transmission cut. Static hissed through the speakers. Elliot's breath caught. Something moved in the recording booth. His eyes darted to the glass window, separating the control room from the booth. The light inside was dim, flickering under the hum of a half-dead fluorescent bulb. Then, a hand pressed against the glass. Long, bony, fingers too many joints, a slow, deliberate tap. Tap, tap. Elliot backed away. The thing inside the booth shifted, its silhouette barely visible. It was watching him. The lights flickered. The glass cracked. Then, the power went out. Everything plunged into darkness, thick and absolute, swallowing even the memory of light. Elliot's breath hitched, his heart hammering in his chest. The room felt too silent. No hum of static, no flickering bulbs, no distant rustling from the thing behind the glass. Then, a whisper. Not from the booth, from right beside him. Elliot. Something breathed against his ear. His body locked up, every muscle screaming for him to run, to move, to do anything. But he couldn't. His limbs refused to listen. Cold fingers brushed against his arm, and a sickening, wrong feeling flooded his veins, like his body was being unwoven, piece by piece. The whisper came again, closer now, inside his head. "Come home, Elliot." His vision fractured. The floor beneath him wasn't there anymore. The walls twisted, stretching like melting wax. The radio station peeled away, dissolving into the black void that swallowed everything. The last thing he saw was the cracked glass of the booth, and the thing behind it, pressing both hands against the barrier, its fingers splayed, its head twitching in unnatural spasms. Then, nothing. Elliot woke up somewhere else. The first thing he noticed was the air, thick, stale, wrong. It pressed against his skin like invisible hands, squeezing, suffocating. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from somewhere above, casting long, warped shadows across the floor. He wasn't alone. A circle of people sat around him, perfectly still, back straight, facing the wall. Their bodies were too rigid. Their heads hung at slightly unnatural angles. They're as if they had been placed there, posed. None of them spoke. None of them moved. At first, Elliot thought they were strangers. But then, one turned its head. His stomach dropped. It had his face. Then another turned. They all looked like him. Elliot couldn't breathe. His mind rejected what he was seeing, but the horror of it only deepened as the faces began to change. Skin twisted, features shifting like clay being reshaped by invisible hands. Some looked half-formed, incomplete versions of him with stretched mouths and hollow sockets. Others looked too perfect, like frozen replicas, but with something missing. Some had too many eyes, some had none at all. Then one stood. Its body jerked unnaturally, limbs unfolding like a puppet with tangled strings. It tilted its head, staring at him with a face that was almost his. Almost. Then its mouth split open. Not a normal mouth, not even remotely human. Rows of teeth, layered, endless, moving. The voice that came out was his own. "Come home, Elliot." The others moved at once. They didn't walk, they lurched, their bodies twisted, their heads turned at impossible angles, bones cracking with wet, grinding pops. Hands reached for him. Too many fingers, too many arms, too many mouths opening where mouths shouldn't be. Elliot ran, but there were too many of them, too many versions of himself, and they were closing in. Elliot ran. His breath tore through his throat in ragged gasps, his legs screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Behind him, the sound of too many footsteps pounded against the floor, out of sync, wrong, broken. He didn't dare look back. He knew what he'd see. Them. Those shifting, twisted things wearing his face. The walls of the dimly lit room stretched as he ran, the air turning thick and oppressive. His vision blurred, his lungs burned. The exit had to be here somewhere. It had to be. The thought of stopping, of letting those things catch him, consume him, become him, it was unbearable. Then, the door appeared. Or maybe it had always been there. Maybe it had just been waiting for him to notice. He didn't care. He didn't think. He threw himself against it, tumbling forward into the open air. Except, the town was gone. Elliot staggered, almost falling into nothing. The houses, the streets, the buildings, all of it had melted into the ground, dissolving into an endless, shifting landscape of blackened ruins. The sky above was a vast, empty void. No stars, no moon, no clouds. Just darkness stretching forever. The air was thick with a smell that wasn't quite smoke, wasn't quite rot. It was something worse. The street beneath his feet twisted. The pavement cracked, the lines of the road warping, stretching like something alive. Buildings that once stood tall now sagged, collapsing inward like they were being devoured by the earth itself. Some still had lights glowing in their windows, but the lights were wrong. Too dim, too distant, flickering like dying eyes. Then his phone buzzed, a final emergency alert. The screen pulsed, the letters forming slow, deliberate words. "You have been seen. You cannot escape." His hands trembled. His pulse thundered in his ears. From the ruins, from the shadows, from the very air itself, they emerged. Not just one, not just a few. Dozens, hundreds, all of them him. Too many hands, too many smiles, too many mouths. Some stood motionless, their hollow eyes locked onto him. Others twitched, spasming unnaturally. One of them, just a few feet away, tilted its head, its face split by a grin too wide for its skull. Elliot took a step back. They took a step forward. A hand landed on his shoulder. Cold fingers pressing down. Elliot froze. His breath caught in his throat, his muscles locking into place. His entire body screamed for him to run, fight, move, anything. But he couldn't. Slowly, he turned, and everything went black.